mules and slip scrapes. And this during that period in the 1910, 1912, the wealthy people from downtown Birmingham came out and bought these farms to have weekend retreats and summer retreats. This one was bought by Mr. Cosby. It has Cosby Milling Company. He had one daughter, and she married a Hodges, and it became the Cosby Hodges Milling Company. And he was the founder of the Boy Scouts in Birmingham. So he gave, and some of us know the Cosby Hodges, Chap Hodges and Spain Hodges and that group were descendants of Mr. Cosby. But Mr. Cosby gave this land and 600 acres to the Boy Scouts. And that's how it became the Boy Scout camp that we knew.
It's like you got all that
This
like
Dumas house that sat just across the creek from your house, but it was falling in when I came along. Nobody lived there. That's where my great grandfather, Obadiah Dumas, lived, and he owned part of the land. And Larry Dumas and the Dumases in Mountain Brook are all cousins.
I remember going to that house, what was left of it when I was a kid.
Okay.
Because I think my parents might have taken some of the rocks and moved them to their house. But I remember that it had
the
chimney
Dumas
on either end of the
house,
house.
and Sylvia's mother was a Dumas.
Yes.
So what happened, based on what
Rosal Dumas. Yeah.
So what happened is, based on my theory, when Joseph Martin was in the quartermaster corps, and during the Civil War, he came to Jefferson County looking for horses. Now, the Dumases and the Martins were French Huguenots. They were all in that borderline of Belgium and France, and they didn't get along with the Catholics, so they all moved to Germany. But the line in there between Belgium, Germany, and France all moved around.
Right.
But at the time that the Martin came, I can't think of his name, George Adam Martin, came from Germany. He was a Baptist preacher. They called him Dunkers. He was part of the German Baptist, and then they migrated on down. But anyway, when Joseph Martin came to Jefferson County looking for horses, he stayed with Obadiah Dumas. How did he find Mr. Dumas unless somewhere back through the French Huguenots and all of that, the Martins and the Dumases knew each other, okay? Because he stayed at that house. That's how he knew about this mill that was right here. He saw the mill when he came looking for the horses, okay? So in 1869, which is about 4 or 5 years after the Civil War, he came back over here talking about Joseph and bought the mill and the house, okay? And that was only because of that excursion that he did in 1865 or 64 or whenever that was. Dumas sold his land to Lewis Clark. Now, Mr. Clark, who had the Clark Theater in Birmingham, and he was a wealthy developer and developed all kind of buildings and properties, and the history of him. He was also the head of the Alabama National Guard, which was real important right after the Civil War because they enforced the laws. We had so many people from other places that were probate judges and governors and things, and they didn't enforce the law. And so the law that was in the South or in Alabama was the National Guard. And he was colonel of the National Guard, or head of the National Guard. Well, he visited Japan. He's a very wealthy man, built the Clark Theater, bought the Hugo Marx house, which is all marble there on Highland Avenue. And he bought all this land and bought the land from the Dumases, and on that site is a spring that makes a pond that's, you know, like an acre. And that's fresh water that runs out, that's the girls' school. But he drilled a well, and the well is an artesian well. And that well in the girls' school is what feeds the tributary that ties in with this one to start making Turkey Creek. Okay. The other branch that comes in to start forming Turkey Creek is what I call the Dumas branch, which is the branch that went between your house and the Dumases. Then the other branch is what I call the Martin branch, which is the one your creek or your spring fed into. But all of those run together, and Elk Spring comes out right here, and they all tied together, and that's where just below the confluence of all of those running together is where the mill dam was. And just downstream from it is where the Martin Mill was. Now, Jeff got us some aerial photographs, and I think you got copies of them on your phone. Okay, sure. I sent them, Jeff sent them to me, and I can send them to you. They're 1940, 1947, 1950, 1956, and they show what I always identify as I start with Camp Cosby. But when you go down to the road that went down to the mill, the Shadow Lake Road, where the Elk Spring, and you went down, I remember that it made a sharp turn and you went down and you crossed Turkey Creek. And Mother always said the mill was right up there, and they had a swinging bridge that was below the mill, and there was another dam below the mill where all the kids went swimming. Now, if you read back in here on some of the descriptions, they talk about the second dam that was just below the bridge. Okay, I mean just below. Now, the reason I think that this is as good a representation of the mill is it was an overshot wheel. It was on the north side of the, I know it was on the north side of the creek. And if you look in the 1940 aerial photograph, you can see a cleaned out place that's just up from where the ford across the creek was. But this little, whoever drew this and put that bridge in, based on what Mother told me, there was a bridge just down below. It was a footbridge. And but she said it was a swinging bridge, and it was swung on cables, and that all makes sense because the millers worried more about being washed away than anything else. They'd build their dams, they'd get their mill going, and then we'd have one of these 100-year floods, and it all had to be done over again. But I cut out and just added. Sam Williams had written Brack Martin and had sent some kind of drawings, and the drawings of it that I have are not very clear. But Mac wrote back, and that's where he says, you know, your drawing of the mill, cut out of the mill, wasn't no small building. It was 22 feet to the second floor from the first, and the Garrett wheel, and goes on and talks about that they had silk belts that drove the wheels, and that they had gotten them from England. And then he talks about these buckets that carried the flour up because they had to double grind the flour. But anyway, when you read that, you know everything that I know. Of course, what's really interesting to me is, you know, he talks about Father had a store in one end of the mill building for a while, but so many people wanted credit, he had to give it up, as there was no one in Washington to help the people in the South. And that's true, there was no money in the South. And y'all probably know that he milled on a share. He didn't take money. Nobody had any money. And I don't know what the percentage was, but I think they had a little divider. I went to the mill that was on Turkey Creek that was down at Pinson. It was still there. You know, we went down there to have our mill ground. And they had some kind of a little dividing device that when the hopper got full, they'd sweep some part of it over to the side, and that was what you were paying the miller. And then you got what was left. It was about 30%, I think. But how did the miller turn that into cash? Well, he took it, bagged it up, put his name on it, and carried it to Birmingham. And that's where you hear these stories about Joseph Martin going to Birmingham to sell mill and flour. And that parlays right on in to Joe Martin having the rolling stores. You know about those? Okay.
I don't know anything.
Okay. Well, anyway, Daddy Jim and Uncle George drove. Joe had a warehouse by his house, and he stocked shoes and boots and all kind of things and took orders. And on Sunday evening, my grandfather would leave, and he rode the route, took me on the route. But he would leave and go to Springville, and he stopped at country stores and delivered what they had ordered the week before, which would be shoes and clothes and any kind of dry goods or anything. And then he would go on to Asheville, Branchville, Leeds, and down, and the last store was a rock store down there on 119, and then he'd go over by Grant's Mill and back to Birmingham, or back to here, and it'd take him a week to make the trip. And he stayed in boarding houses or slept under the trucks. They were Model T trucks. And on the way, people would stop them, and if they had something, they would barter. They'd trade off a pair of shoes for a chicken and all this. And so Daddy Jim told me that the time he got back, he'd have horses and cows and all this stuff tied onto his truck. And if you ever go down to where the Iron Bridge is and you cross from what used to be the, I've got to think the people's name in a minute. They had a dairy down there. It had this country store at Lake Purdy. And you go up this little old steep hill to go to Grant's Mill.
Yeah.
Daddy Jim said it got down there and the truck wouldn't climb the hill.
No.
And a Model T truck was more powerful in reverse than it was
back up the hill. Yeah.
So he took the horses and all and tied them off in the bushes, turned the truck around and backed it up the hill.
Yeah.
Got up to the top of the hill and turned it around, and then went down and got all the mules and the horses and all, and came on back around. But that was your grandfather that was running that all, and he had more than one truck.
Yeah.
But that all kind of came from Joseph Martin having these deliveries into Birmingham.
I've never heard of any of that.
Okay. And you know Elizabeth Sharp,
Yeah.
Elizabeth Martin Sharp and Charles Sharp had Birmingham Egg and Poultry.
Right.
And they killed chickens and all.
Yeah.
Delivered fresh
And
chickens
eggs.
and eggs. And that all came out of the same trading family of selling stuff to make a living. It was hard-working people.
All I knew was my dad drove a truck and delivered eggs.
Yeah.
That's all I knew about. He never talked about his father.
Well, he was, see, this would have been, your dad was my mother's contemporary.
Right.
And then my grandfather, the one that was driving the trucks and doing all that, was your grandfather's contemporary, same age group. But they ran those trucks and all.